author of this new book, They Said They Wanted Revolution, a memoir of my parents. And the memoir, yes! This memoir reflects on her family's emotional experience of the Iranian Revolution. Her parents, who were radicalized at Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s, left the United States in 1979 to join the Iranian Revolution, a decision that ultimately changed the course of Netta's life. That memoir is why we're here today, and luckily she will be reading portions of the book, and I'm actually going to ask Netta to start off by reading an excerpt from the book.
Thank you guys for being here. Can you hear me okay? So I'm going to read from what is essentially the end of the book, but it was kind of the key to the memoir for me. Whoever you are, whoever you are, whoever you may be, maybe you. It doesn't matter who you are. I want you, whoever you are, to hear this. Whoever you are, I want you because I need to tell you. I need to tell you a story, to write you a story. I will find you and read you this story. If you can't hear and don't read, I want to show this story to you, this story. But I do want you. I want you to try to read, to see, to listen to the story about me. It is about me, a little bit. It is a little bit about me, but it isn't only. It is a story about a lot of people I know and people I never will. It is a story, many stories really, about place and places and some of the people who moved between those, who moved across those lines, who crossed those lines. It is a story about people who moved between places and through time. It is about the past, about journeys I stitched together, scrap by scrap, until the present came through. I wove them into a story I made from wisps gathered from here and there, wisps threaded through an eye, pierced into a scene, leading from then into later. It might explain how now is. It might explain today's sun. That is how the story was built, but it is a tale about how things began. I want to tell you about what was built and how it was broken. I want to tell you about what we lost, about what I lost, about those lost. I want to tell you all the things lost to me and to you, about all the loss that built up like scum on a window and dust on a ledge. I want to tell you about all the loss swept together, piled loss on top of loss, until it became something. Something scattered like seeds, something like light, something like lies, something like diaspora. I will tell you about those who dispersed, about the dispersed, about those who came apart together, and those who then came together, about the ones who lived through losing, who lived throughout the loosening, who wound themselves tight, who tightened and bruised, who became a new thing. I will tell you some things about them.
You end the, I feel like weird, I'm like looking out this way, but looking at you, and this is like a family and friends gathering tonight, so it's really special to be here with you, Netta, and that excerpt, which you said is the end, is so beautiful, and one of the things that struck me about it was, and your entire book actually, is that while it is a very personal and particular story about you and your family, it's also kind of this universal narrative and experience that as a reader you're taking us through. So many of us are born into traumas that we didn't resolve or have a chance to resolve, or the people before us didn't get to resolve. And we all have our family secrets in this, right? That these stories we pass down. So can you tell us, and for those who haven't had a chance to read, I'm assuming everyone here has read it, but who knows who's watching at home, for posterity. For those who haven't read it, because you reveal a little bit in the book about this, but maybe even for those who have read it, can you tell us about how this idea first germinated for you, specifically to take on this project as almost like a reporter investigating her history, and where did that idea germinate, and how did it come into this?
Yeah, and I started writing this book when I was 8 years old, I think. That's where the third section, when it becomes more specifically about me, really starts. I think one of the things that I kind of explore in the book and tried really to unravel was these stories that each one of us carry with us that kind of make up who we are. And we carry with us ancestors both that we know and that we don't know. And somehow we end up sorry, I just want to wave to everyone.
Yeah, no, we just jumped in.
I mean, I haven't seen some people, but it's like a long pandemic. Hello. I'm sweating. No, but we carry with us these generations, and I think sometimes, not sometimes, most of the time, we don't take enough time, and it's not a judgmental thing, it's just we don't have the time to sit down and ask the follow-up questions. And I think one of the joys and one of the privileges of being a journalist is it's your job to ask as many questions as you can possibly think of. And I think, we've talked about like the cultural thing of asking questions of your elders. And I think there's something about inviting somebody to share their story with you that I think as a journalist, you're trained to do, especially when you're trying to get at sort of larger truths. So that was kind of, it was a story that I'd been chasing my entire life. Why did I lose my father? Why did we end up having to leave Iran? What did it mean? What did it mean that there felt like there was part of me that was incongruous with the world around me? And I think there comes a point in all of our lives where you either decide to stop running from those questions, and you just decide to like stay in place and start asking the questions that are going to lead to answers. And then, of course, you have to hear some uncomfortable answers to questions, which is, I think, it's one thing when you're investigating or when you're reporting on people that aren't your family. But it's another thing when you have to kind of steel yourself for the answers to questions, to get answers that maybe you don't want.
Yeah. Actually, I did want to ask you about that. It is one thing as a reporter to, like you said, to interview someone or chase a story or that you have a level of detachment from. What did you do with that fear you felt around potentially uncovering things that were uncomfortable for you that could upend how you viewed yourself or your family?
I went to therapy. That was great. I spent a lot of time with my therapist. That's a good question. There's a reason why this book took almost 10 years to write. I think I started, one of the things I did at the beginning of this process, because somehow I think I was a journalist long enough to know that the story was going to change as soon as I started asking questions. So the first thing I did was to write down all the stories that I had questions about that had been told over time, and write them exactly how I knew them. Because I knew that as soon as I sat down for that first interview, those stories weren't going to exist anymore. And our memories are so, they fade so quickly, and we end up, kind of solving for new information. So that was the first exercise. And actually I went back last year when I was fact checking the memoir and reread those early drafts, and it was like visiting your younger self. It was very different. Yeah, it was very different. It was really, I was really proud of actually having had thought about doing that, but also about deciding very consciously to kind of dismantle those myths, essentially stories.
I think it takes a certain level of courage to be able to undertake that. were there any particular interviews or anything that, like we were talking earlier about the cultural norms around asking questions of your elders, but also asking people to revisit really traumatic things and how taxing that can be. Did your training as a journalist prepare you for that? And in what ways did it kind of handicap you?
That's a good question. I think some of my family members.
Some of them are here.
Some of the people who I interviewed for days and hours are here.
Maybe you should ask them.
I know, they might have it better. They're all here though, so we've gotten through it.
Thank you to them.
Yeah, actually. There are some people who really spent just an extraordinary amount of time with me and shared so much of themselves and journals and stories and pictures. And I think what I did was the thing that I do when I report, which is to very clearly ask or remind your source, whoever you're interviewing, that they are on the record, they can go off the record, that this is essentially a professional relationship. And part of the reason I do that, especially when you're doing longer, more intense, potentially traumatizing or re-traumatizing interviews, is I want to give people both agency to be able to say when to stop, but also I don't want them to have to take care of me.
Right.
And I also need to have permission to take care of myself in that. And the thing that doesn't work with a family member is that they continue to be your family member, even in the course of that exchange. So that was one thing, but it wasn't just my family members, it was people that I was very close to or my parents were close to, or it turns out that I have a certain level of empathy for humans, so watching people get very upset, or one of the things that I got pretty good at was checking with how people were breathing. This is like very processing and inside baseball, but one of the things I noticed, and it depended on who the person was, but sometimes you could tell by how their breathing changed, or you could tell by different tics that they had that we were getting too close, or if they circled back on their stories, and suddenly you can just tell when someone's starting to get triggered, triggered is probably a catchphrase, but when you're getting too close and they're not ready. And then it became about me pulling back and trying to refocus the interview and give them a chance to catch up and decide really if this is some place that they wanted to go. And a lot of that, I think, again, part of the reason why the book took so long was giving people enough time and space within the interviews to kind of lead the interviews. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does
to me.
But yeah, it becomes really complicated. I think being a reporter is a complicated thing. I think having relationships with your sources, it's all well and good when we were on the Hill. It's easy to say, we're both Hilford, that's how we know each other, but it's easy to say, you are a source, you're not my friend. But when you get out of those professional relationships, it becomes a little bit murkier, and that it was always finding that line of where the personal happens. And you need some of that personal, and you need some of that empathy, and you need that real humanity to come through in your work, but you also need the buffering for both source and reporter.
I have so many questions about process, so maybe I'll return to it. I don't know how much other people want to hear about that, but I'm so fascinated by that. Maybe we can turn a little bit to the content of the book itself. One of the things I was really struck by was your exploration of the student activism movement in the United States among the Iranian diaspora. I'm of the Iranian diaspora, and I didn't realize that the largest foreign student population for some period of time in the United States was from Iran. Did you, as you were reporting this out and talking to people who were activists at that time and just digging up archival footage, were you surprised at what you were learning? Did you feel this story hadn't been told? I hadn't read this story before until I read your book.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Like, I think there's so much that's been sort of either ignored or kind of papered over when it comes to the Iranian student movement. But I think one of the cool parts of the book, I guess, is like or very few people had sat with these archives. And there's a lot of information out there. I mean, I think arguably this is the most effective student movement in history. They were integral to upending monarchy, and I don't think the revolution would have succeeded. I think that's pretty much everybody who knows the history can agree that the revolution wouldn't have succeeded without a transnational student movement. And I think when people, it's really interesting. It was interesting covering the Trump administration, having people be so certain about America's place in the world, because I think once you come from a country, once your history is kind of wrapped up in a country like Iran, one of the things you know really well is how easily things can come crumbling down. Now, having said that, like it was a coalition, but it's the part of the revolution that people don't talk about, and there isn't a lot of credence given to it. And it was a sophisticated movement, in the likes of which I don't think we see now. I mean, I can't think of any other group that's been as effective.
Yeah, I'm again assuming a lot of you have read this book or know intimately about this. Setting the scene in the 60s and 70s in California and Berkeley, and I'm wondering actually if we can turn back to the book. Well, actually, before I get to that, I did want to ask you more about that. Did you feel like as you were working on this and digging through that archival research or sitting with these archives that a lot of people kind of sat with, that you were like, did you know that you would make this kind of contribution to putting this story out there? Because doesn't it seem like a lot of stories about Iran and the Iranian diaspora they're very two-dimensional. They're not they don't have this other layer to them, and it's a big part of the story, like you just said.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. That now that the revolution has happened, it feels like it was inevitable. But one of the things that I think was so interesting as I was doing the research and reporting for this book was Iran and the US were intimately intertwined since the 1953 coup. And one of the really interesting parts was kind of mapping one of the things, like 3 weeks after the coup, students were given visas almost immediately to come over to the US and study here. And so I literally did 2 timelines, where it was what was happening in the US and Europe politically, and then where the students were landing and what time the students were landing. And when the Iranians were coming over to the States, they were landing in places like New York and Northern California, which I talk about. But they're also Lubbock, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. They're all over. And as anybody who has a passing interest in migration or immigration knows, is that it's normally a steps situation where somebody gets there and brings over their siblings or their friends or whatever. And so that's basically what happened. And as we're getting deeper into the 1960s, not just in the States, but obviously in Europe, you have Iranians coming, and you have to remember under the Shah, you didn't have a free press in the same way that we did other places. There was one political party after a certain point. Political dissent was essentially outlawed. So then you had students coming here at kind of, not just again in the States, but in Europe as well, and kind of the swirl of political ideology and enthusiasm. And, they were young. And they were young in that way, and smart, and really interested in what was happening. Because, think about any time you study abroad, right? Like, we all went to Spain and came back with an accent. Like, you just, want to absorb as much of that culture and that moment as possible. But the idea was always that people were going to go back to Iran. And then there was a takeover of the consulate in San Francisco, which I write about in the book. And after that, it was essentially illegal for people to be involved in the Confederation, the Iranian student movement. So they were all, even if you had like a pass, if you went to a demonstration or whatever, you were suddenly more or less in exile. You could play with it, you could push it, you know.
The stakes were
much higher. And so, you know, and what I write about in the book is either people end up leaving the movement altogether or doubling down. And so that kind of intersection of all these different histories became so fascinating to me. And I couldn't find anybody that had done a deep dive of that.
Yeah.
And so I hope people do who are much, you know, smarter than I am and know more than I do.
Yeah, and I think you're certainly plenty smart enough to have made that contribution, but what's beautiful about the work that you did, and I think the best kind of journalism does, is it centers these histories and these stories on real humans. And so the real humans here in this case are your parents and also their associates and friends, and the San Francisco consulate takeover that you just mentioned. It was complicated. There were people involved in that who didn't realize what they would be involved in, and all of a sudden they're exiles and they didn't ask for this. So it's just a very complicated and complex narrative. These are not black and white issues. We often live in the gray. I'm actually wondering if you wouldn't mind reading a little more from the book, describing a portion from your book describing your mother's first day at Berkeley. So like when she first sort of arrives in this milieu that you were talking about.
On that first day in Berkeley, she walked hurriedly down Telegraph Avenue. She had a quick, funny gait, heels in and toes out. It pitched her hips back and forth in a way that was a little tomboyish, a little suggestive. She found the sublet, which belonged to a young couple who were visiting Iran for a few months. The apartment was essentially a small room, but my mother took it to share with another Iranian girl, I'll call Naz, who was a few years younger than she, the little sister of a friend. The girls moved into the studio with a love seat, milk crates, a phone, and a turntable. They slapped fat, psychedelic flowered decals on the wall and pulled down the Murphy bed to share. That summer, their apartment was where everyone gathered on the way to the Iran House, the meeting place for all the Iranian Student Association chapters in Northern California, a couple blocks away. Do you remember falling for your friends? Do you remember the rush of it, the delight of it, the relief and the joy of it? The feeling was, oh, of course, of course. The feeling was one of being found, finally. Found in a way that made you realize you had been lost, floating aimlessly in a too big world. The feeling was, I'm not alone, not any longer. I'm not a freak. I'm accepted, and I accept in return. Life became an exclamation point. The blood sang, and the heart expanded. So it was for my mother, and so it was for my father, and so it would be for me.
Thank you. Now I don't want to give the whole story away necessarily, or try to recap the whole story here, but you take us from there through those decisions they've made and what you described as sort of that turning point where some people doubled down and some people left the movement. Eventually your parents made it back to Iran. You were born, there was a revolution, and your father was arrested and everything changed. And you describe here, and you actually go and report out your family's estate, which you were alive for as a child. What was that experience like? What did you remember of it, and what holes did you fill in? Did you almost feel like, I think we talked about it the other day, that you were telling making room for a child's story as well?
Yeah, that section of the book took probably 4 years to report and write.
Yeah, and you went back to some of these places, right?
Yeah, I went back to Bonn. In fact, there's a couple reporters here who I helped write our Afghanistan special. And Seb, who was there, had this piece where he is with, where he lands in Kabul and he's talking to this Afghan family. And one of the kids was my age, probably, a little bit. One was my cousin, who was 5, 6 months old, and the other was a toddler. And they're speaking Farsi, right? And like, I mean, I think that she was speaking Farsi. And there was this moment, and then later in the special, we go back to Bonn. We're in the exact sort of hills that my family went across. And so I say this because we as journalists act as interpreters for people's experiences, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I mean, there are some of the best journalists I've ever worked with in this room, and what they do is just, a service, really. But here was this one person who had started her life essentially one way, and then there was a clear delineation. And my brother was born, my mother was pregnant when we were on our journey, so he was born in California. So he was born into an entirely different country, a different family, a different culture. And I happened to be somebody who wrote journals from the time I was a kid. So there was this moment where I had to think about, how was I going to tell the story? Where did I come in? And I tried to write it as an adult, and it wasn't working. There was something about it that didn't seem true. And so I went back and I read my journals from the time I was a kid until, now, essentially. And one of the things that I realized, I just wasn't consciously thinking about this until after it was done, but children aren't given the chance to tell their own stories for lots of reasons. Adults are constantly filtering it, and even I did that by editing these journals, thank God. But but it was a chance to give a child who was a refugee a chance to tell her story and how she kept going over these stories again and trying to have totally legitimate questions answered over, and she kept asking them and trying to answer them. And some of them were big questions, like how does death work? How does mortality work? Why did I lose my father? Why was there politics involved? Like, how do I fit in this bigger story, and what have I lost as a result of it? And then what have I gained, And to do that at 8, 9, 10, 14, into your 30s, I thought was an interesting progression. And so that's basically it. It was a chance to give a kid the chance to tell her own story.
Yeah. I am going to turn it over to audience questions in a little bit, so you can start thinking of the questions you would like to ask Meta. You mentioned your brother and how his relationship to
Who's my brother?
This was sitting here. Let's talk about it. Before he gets here. Let's ask the brother question.
Very on brand.
Well, you mentioned how your brother was born here, and you talk about in the book his relationship to this story, to your family story, differs from yours, because you were born in Iran and you have some memory of there, and you also had these experiences with your family there. And like this whole concept of the third culture kid and all of this sort of, and I consider myself one of those too, and I was born here, and so I don't have the same relationship with Iran as maybe my older brother does, who was in Iran as a child for some time, knew my grandparents. Like, I never got to meet my grandparents, and so I'm just wondering, like, this sort of tether, the tether that you had to the place. I don't know what my question is actually. I'm just like really struck by like this contribution to this broader narrative of third culture kids, the group of people who their experience growing up is completely different in a completely different place than their parents or from where they were originally from, and it seems like we're constantly trying to get back to a place of belonging. And then you even write about in the book, like when you did go to Iran and what that experience was like, when you went as basically a young adult and trying to almost like find yourself in your place in the world, like not being American enough, not being Iranian enough, and the resolution you sort of come to in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my relationship with being Iranian and with the country of Iran, like my relationship with America, with the United States, is complicated, obviously. I think it took me a long time I spent a lot of time kind of looking at how it felt like other people had such a simple, such like an easy connection with their culture, with both their Americanness and their Iranianness in a way that was not simple for me. I think going back to Iran, I thought I was going to have the same experience my mother did, which was essentially to step off a plane when she went back at 20 and feel very much at home.
And what year was that again?
It was 68. Okay.
Yeah.
My mother came when she was to the States when she was 10. And so she stepped up and she felt very much finally understood and at home. And for me, I felt confused. You know, I thought I spoke Farsi well enough, and it turns out I didn't speak it that well at all, and I didn't understand a lot of I just didn't understand a lot of the country. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was told over and over again I didn't belong. Mm. And so that feeling of, and then realizing that I had a lot of anger, you know, like I very much blame the country. And it seems so silly to say I blame the country for things, but I felt a lot of complicated feelings about it. And so I think by the time I had to leave Iran again, I felt a little bit more at home there, and at home with feeling of two places, which is, I think, the experience of a lot of us. But later, when I was writing the book, I did a lot of research on childhood development and what happens before you get words, and what it means to have been taken out of a country before you're able to express what that means. And that felt really interesting. For somebody who spends a lot of time with words, it felt really interesting about how memory is stored in your body as a child is different. And so all of those kind of, I tried to kind of write through all of those in the book as well.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you before we turn it over to our audience here is, you spent years on this. How did the process of writing this book change you and how you relate to your family, to yourself, to the world?
I think the great gift of this book was to help integrate all the parts of myself that felt at odds. I think the book let me have some peace. It was also an excuse to grieve very deeply. I got to spend a lot of time with my parents, and I don't think that it was a great luxury to be able to get to know my parents as much as I could when they were young, because my dad died when he was 38, and my mom died 12 years ago now. So I got to kind of, it's a luxury to spend time with the people you miss. You know what I mean? And I got to really do that in a way that was for a long time my job, essentially. And put them in context and explore their flaws and the stuff that made them exceptional. So the book, I think the process of finding the story and recording the book was something that took my first 40 years. And then I end the book essentially with my son. And I remember when I was writing that, it was 2 weeks after the insurrection, and I could all of a sudden see all the questions my son would be asking me, which were very similar to the questions that I had of my parents. And so there was a putting down of a book. It was like, and letting yourself be refracted, essentially. Like, I'm in this volume and it is out in the world. And now I get to do something else.
Thank you. It was time to now invite anyone who might have a question. There's a microphone here, and just so you know, we were streaming this, but I believe the streaming is off now, so you can ask your really hard-hitting question. All the scandals can spill out, we'll keep it in the room.
I will turn off live stream in just a second, but thank you to our live stream audience.
Yes, thank you.
And yes, if anybody would like, this is very happy. If anybody would like to use the microphone, you're welcome to step up. If you are comfortable projecting, that is okay too. I'd also like to remind everyone that dinner service is available now or after the show.
The show. Oh, it's a show.
There's a show, everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be, because I'm having a little trouble. Thank you.